Do the BC land acknowledgement issues signal the end of Canada as we know it? And what holds us together? Is there hope for Canada's future? Check it out.
It happens to be something I talk about a lot, but land acknowledgements in schools. My kids go to school every day, and kids go down to the office and they into the loudspeaker or whatever they two kids like together say this land acknowledgement, and all the kids listen, and every single day, just like they sing the Coast Salish anthem alongside O Canada at every school assembly. I look at those things, and when you're singing an anthem alongside your national anthem for a community that you can never belong to and never participate in by virtue of your ancestry.
What anthem are they singing?
They call it the Coast Salish anthem in this particular area, so that the Coast Salish is a broader kind of characterization of some of the Indigenous groups that exist in the region. So having kids sing that when they have no ability to belong to that political community, I think it's good to learn it for cultural reasons. Sure, like learn about different cultures. That's actually a very positive thing. But to sing it alongside O Canada in that way, to me, is actually a very troubling message.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Whatley, and today we spoke with Dr. Caroline Elliott. She's a co-founder of Without Diminishment. She just recently got her PhD specializing in Canadian liberal democracy from Simon Fraser University. She's a political commentator. She's on the board of the Land Use Society, and she's also a senior fellow with the Aristotle Foundation, a think tank based in Calgary. We had a wide-ranging discussion, starting out with her work around the new media outlet called Without Diminishment. Then we talked about two very provocative pieces that she published in the National Post just this summer. One was talking about whether or not the end of Canada is coming, given the BC NDP government bowing to Aboriginal land claims. And another piece talking about whether the BC government was laying the groundwork for turning private property into Aboriginal land. Dr. Elliott mentions that there are over 200 First Nations communities in BC, and massive amounts of private property, currently owned private property, have land right claims placed on them by the Aboriginal community. Dr. Elliott did her PhD comparing constitutional approaches with self-governing, autonomous societies within a larger community. She's gone right down to first principles on how we can exist together as a country, given some people having completely different visions about what democracy means, what are our democratic liberal first principles, what does it mean to have private property, what does it mean to have the right to vote, does ancestry put you at the head of the line? Part of our conversation focused on what kids are learning in schools right now. She mentioned that in British Columbia, children hear not only a land acknowledgement over the loudspeakers every morning, but they hear two national anthems. One Canadian national anthem, the Canadian national anthem, and then an Aboriginal national anthem, at least for the tribes and the nations in that particular area. How are we able to build a country when children are learning right from the youngest age that Canada is not something to be happy about, not something to be grateful for? In fact, Canada is something to be ashamed about, given our terrible or so-called terrible history. Think of the new Canadians going to Canadian public schools and hearing that Canada is actually someplace they maybe shouldn't be too happy about, and perhaps Canada needs to be fundamentally changed. How are they going to be able to integrate into whatever Canada is now? So we had a spicy discussion about issues that now are becoming salient in the public square. First Nations issues, land claims, immigration. What does it mean to be Canadian? And we ended with a message of hope. I think there's an opportunity for us to rediscover what it means to be Canadian, what it means to hold together. What are the minimalist criteria that we expect for people to uphold and support if we're going to live together in Canada. Really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome, Caroline Elliott.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. It's really good to finally to pin you down. And actually, we're allowed to call you Dr. Elliott because now you've qualified for your PhD. And I was saying in the green room, this is not like defending your PhD. So no stress here at all.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. Anyways, I wanted to start with your work on Without Diminishment. So you and several others have launched a new, very exciting Substack. And so why did you do that?
Well, we really, I think, noticed a gap in the discourse on the right, where a lot of the commentary around the challenges facing Canada and British Columbia, a lot of they weren't being spoken about in their fullest form, I guess, right? So it kind of felt like in a lot of the media, particularly the mainstream media, but more broadly as well, there was a sense that if something doesn't have a dollar figure attached to it, it's not like a real issue, right? So if we're not talking about economics, or if we're not talking about deregulation or private sector job creation, all of which, of course, are really important things. But if we weren't talking about those things, they were kind of that we were somehow engaging in a form of, I don't know, like a culture war, as it's called, kind of in a negative way. And we kind of thought, well, some of these issues need to be talked about, and we need to be willing to kind of talk about who we are as a society. What are we actually aiming for? What are the things that bind us together as Canadians? What are the things that we need to look at that could be kind of testing some of those boundaries or characterizations? So that's kind of how it arose. And I think it's even become more broad than that. But it's been a very fun project so far.
Yeah. And why does it feel so subversive? Like it feels like you guys are really upsetting the apple cart by doing this.
Yeah, it sort of surprised us a little bit, I think, but maybe it shouldn't have, because we are testing boundaries, right? And we're out there and we're saying, look, like, the right in, again, British Columbia and Canada, I think, have been very hesitant to engage in some of these things, like to defend our country's history and our values, are very legitimately. They've been reluctant to take on the steady creep of ideology to our school system. They've been reluctant to take on what's happening in BC, a very radical reconciliation agenda, kind of soul-destroying approach to drug policy. Like, there's so many difficult, hard things going on, and such a reluctance to kind of take on those issues in a meaningful way. So yeah, maybe we are upsetting the apple cart a little bit, but I think it's important. And if we don't kind of give a platform for those conversations to be had in a thoughtful way, the conversations will still be had, but they may be done in ways where kind of bad actors on the left and the right are willing to jump in and try to draw the conversation their way that probably aren't, and I don't think that's going to be the most productive way forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have to be careful asking you this because you have your PhD in liberal democracy. So be merciful on the questioner here. But you mentioned legitimacy. You said soul destroying. You said hard things. And so it seems to me like you are asking questions, or you're creating space for questions to be asked that, at least since World War II, have fallen outside of the liberal democratic mainstream, shall we say. And when I use those words, I'm thinking of, okay, we've settled all those big, huge questions. We don't have to ask those big questions. What does it mean to be a human? What is the legitimate basis for authority in politics? What does it mean to be a political representative? And it seems like you and your co-founders are saying, hang on, all these questions are now up for grabs again. Now, is that just me seeing that, or I'm just picking up on some of the words you've used? It sounds like you're now asking those fundamental questions again because they seem to be salient in today's conversations.
Yeah, I think the challenge that happens, I think, with liberalism, and I consider myself, I'm a very, very strong proponent of liberal democracy, liberal democratic principle, individual freedom. I believe in all of those things very strongly. But I think part of what we lose sometimes in the conversation is a sense that One, just plain old kind of what's the word, like unrestrained individualism, the pure focus on individualism stops us from thinking about our role in a broader community as kind of humans, with people who belong to families, communities. They might belong to churches or I don't know, rotting gun clubs or something. Like there's all kinds of different ways that people can feel a sense of belonging, and those things are very material and important to people. So I think sometimes we lose sight of that, but we also kind of, in our quest for liberal neutrality all the time, I think what we're doing is we're kind of leaving the playing field very open to kind of the progressive left. And that's the kind way of putting it, I think, but the progressive left who have no problem pushing their ideology into our schools, our institutions, our courts, our legislatures, wherever it is. So they're quite aggressively pursuing an agenda that I think is quite damaging to actually basic liberal democratic principles in many ways. And we're not on the playing field at all because we're saying, oh no, we're very value neutral people and we wouldn't want to possibly assert ourselves in any way. But it is happening. It's just we're not playing the game. So I think that that's where we have to start thinking about what we're teaching our kids. And I'm not trying to say partisan in any way. Of course, that's inappropriate in a school system, but certainly advocating for our country is actually a very good place to be. Understanding our history is actually a very, of course, as with every country, mistakes are made. Like things happen that are every country. There's no country without a difficult past in one way or another. And of course, we have that too. But understanding that Canada is a good country, a great place to be. There's a reason why millions of people want to come join us here. And being proud of that history and being unapologetic about our legitimacy as a country in that regard.
Yeah, well said. So as you're saying some of that, currently I'm reading multiple books at the same time. I'm not sure if it's my ADHD that lets me read lots of books. And so one book that I've been digging into is Lionel Trilling's The Liberal Imagination. It was written in, I believe it's 1955. And he's the guy who famously said that, conservatives don't really have ideas. They just have irritable mental gestures that seek to resemble ideas. So basically he said he was a big proponent of the liberal consensus theory. Really, there is nothing beyond liberalism in North America. And Fukuyama even has picked up on that. He said, one of the reasons people are so angry about liberalism now is because it's been so successful. And it's just so boring now. All we have to do is talk about minimum wage and old age security benefits. All those other things have been fixed and done for. And yet what you just said, this pretense of liberal neutrality, leaves us with no way to respond to the progressives who are saying, oh yeah, no, men are women, women are men, and men can compete in women's sports. All these hot button issues that we see in the headlines, we're now scrambling and saying, wait, we don't have the resources to push back and say, no, what you're saying doesn't make sense, and here are the reasons why. And that's what I see without diminishment, is you and your crew, your team, your expanding team, have said, no, actually there are reasons. We just have to start remembering what those reasons are. Now, am I crafting what you're doing in an incorrect way, or is that kind of what you're doing?
No, I think that's a fair way of putting it. We had a really good event yesterday in Vancouver featuring Etienne Beauregard.
Yeah.
And he was presenting his new book that he's written. And one of the questions that came up I thought was very interesting. Someone said, well, you're a Quebecer. You believe in kind of, there were days when kind of the West used to be mad, well, I don't think those days have actually left, but are mad at Quebec, and Quebec is mad at the West, and so on. And, can you actually have an identity that binds across those kind of different entities in Canada and so on? Like, is there a Canadian national identity? Was kind of the way some of the questions were going. And I thought that, I don't want to put words in his mouth, so I'll just say my interpretation of kind of how the conversation went was about, some of these things are actually, they transcend even Canada. They're Western values, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what we lose sight of when we're trying to kind of itemize like, oh, what's Canada's national identity? What's British Columbia's provincial identity? What's Quebec's, provincial identity or national identity, as some see it over there. But I think the bigger thing is like, do we actually stand for some values like, liberal democracy, tolerance, equality, all the things that come along with that, and how does that bind us? And how well are we safeguarding those very important concepts against their forces that are out there? That maybe don't put the same value on those fundamental principles.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, no,
I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, no, it does. It gets me too excited. Actually, I apologize if it seemed like I was wanting to cut you off, but I liked. But I'll continue to cut you off. I liked your comment about Western values, and EA is one of my heroes too. I've had him on, and I've been at conferences with him, and he's been, I've had him on panels. And so, I just love what he's doing. And he says, Sean, you guys don't fight for your culture. He said to us, we Quebecers, that's all we've done for the last 50, 60 years, or maybe as long as Canada has existed. We fight for a distinct Quebec culture. He said, you guys in English Canada, you don't fight for anything. And so why should you be surprised that you have... you don't have the resources to push back against people who are doing things that you and I would say, wait a second, didn't your mom tell you you're not supposed to do that? Didn't someone tell you you're not supposed to block the streets in downtown Toronto when the ambulance wants to get through, especially when it's an unsanctioned protest? So we've got a kid who needs emergency care and you're blocking the ambulance and you think that's Canadians? Anyways, I'm getting too excited about this, but that's why I like, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I want to tell a total anecdotal story just because we're on this subject. And I was just talking about this yesterday. Actually, I was in Quebec recently, and we were in Quebec City on the Plains of Abraham, and I looked over, and there was, I don't know, 1 or 2 classrooms of young children, maybe 8 years old, 10 years old, and they're acting out, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and there's kind of the English side, and there's the French side, and they're chanting in French and English, saying like, "Nous sommes les Français, we are the English," and then they go and they kind of pretend to battle. But I was watching that when I was there, and I was like, man, like they really they instill their history, they instill their culture into their children in a way that I don't think that we do. Certainly, I don't feel that happens in British Columbia, watching my own kids in the school system to any extent like that. And there was kind of a pride of that history that just kind of emanated from every corner of Quebec City in particular. That I just thought it's worth emulating in that sense, where the common history is told and taught to generation after generation of children.
Yeah. Well, something is taught, but it's certainly not that, right? And so either you're taught that history is totally irrelevant and only the future matters. So that's one approach. Anyways, we better not get too far off topic into pedagogy. I didn't warn you that we'd be talking about education and pedagogy. One thing that you're quite famous for right now, and another provocative thing, very subversive. I'm going to read you 2 headlines from articles that were published that you wrote. Now, in fairness, the headlines are usually written by headline editors, so maybe you didn't actually put these words down, but this is what the National Post put on your articles. So in July, it was this, quote, "The end of Canada is coming, and BC's NDP is leading the charge," end quote. And then in October, just recently, October 28th, quote, the BC government laid the groundwork for turning private property into Aboriginal land, end quote. So tell us about that, and how come you're still able to remain in society? I thought you're not allowed to say those things these days.
Well, I've been saying them for a long time, and for a long time I think I was the only one, almost literally, in British Columbia who is kind of drawing attention to these things. Probably the first time that I really spoke up was around I've been thinking about this issue as far back as my master's in 2009, but even prior to that, I could see where this was going. And I was quite certain it would end up almost exactly where we are today, in a very unworkable situation. And there's a reason I did my dissertation for my PhD in a very similar subject. because I wanted to equip myself well to be able to talk about these things in a thoughtful way. So that kind of going back a bit, but look, those columns are a couple of many that I've written on the subject. The first one I think I wrote was probably 2021 around the closure of the Joffrey Lakes Provincial Park to non-Indigenous British Columbian. At the time, people thought I was a little bit crazy for speaking up on the issue, but I'm glad I did. I'm glad the window seems to be shifting to be able to have a conversation about these things because it's very, very important. I believe it's the single biggest existential issue facing British Columbia, and I don't think I'm overstating or exaggerating. But yeah, I mean, the end of Canada is coming in. The BC NDP is leading the charge. I mean, it's true. I don't write the headlines, but I was at an event in Victoria just the other week talking about this very thing, and I had someone come up to me and say, you know, when I first saw that headline, I thought you were kind of just being really sensational and sensationalist, whatever the word is, overstating it. And he said, but now he's like, I understand with the Cowichan decision, with the land use agreements, with the Haida agreement, all these different initiatives that the provincial government, or the Cowichan decision, the court ruling it a bit different, but all of these different things that are going on, and they're going on at such an incredible pace that's hard to keep up with. And this gentleman said to me, I thought you were overstating it, but now I realize you were absolutely right. And I think that is true.
So you're finding more people now are not just open to the message, or are they willing to support you in what you're saying?
Yeah, I think there's an openness and support for the message. I think there's an openness to hearing it. I do think a lot of it has to do with tone and kind of making arguments in good faith and kind of explaining things from a first principles perspective. To describe what I see as, again, the biggest challenge facing this province in particular. It's a big challenge for Canada as well. But I think kind of starting from the premise is like, okay, do we care about democratic principles? And we kind of get head nodding. We're like, well, yeah, that seems pretty important. Well, here's how these policies are seriously undermining democratic principles. And so you kind of start from a place of agreement and bring people over to understand the consequences of what's going on, is what I've been doing. And for that reason, I think that there is some real openness. And of course, the Cowichan decision really cracked the whole thing open in terms of broad public attention and concern about the issue. When you start having private property rights impacts from court rulings and things, people suddenly sit up and pay attention. And so I think that's what's happening now.
So, Dr. Elliott, you mentioned your master's. You mentioned needing to go deep. You mentioned first principles. And so, I mean, that's a shiny object to say we have to talk about your PhD work, or at least give you the opportunity to talk about it and go as nerdy as you want. But as I understand it, you did your PhD, and I'm going to mangle this, so you'll have to straighten it out. But you looked at the issue of cultural autonomy and self-government. And you did this by reviewing a whole bunch of different approaches to constitutions of self-governing groups. And you tried to look at how those constitutions differ from the Canadian Constitution and whether or not those different approaches can live together, can coexist. Now, that's just me mangling the work that you've done, but I want you to talk about that and reflect on whether or not you're seeing this as kind of a core issue in these land use fiascos that we're seeing.
Well, the reason I took a sip of my coffee is because I'm quite worried I'm going to put you to sleep and myself to sleep if I talk too much about it. So anyone who's watching this, drink some coffee. But look, I won't dive too deep. But I mean, you more or less, I think, described it right. I care about liberal democratic principle very, very deeply. And I have long been following this issue, Section 35 of the Constitution, Section 25 of the Constitution. How do you kind of reconcile something like what's been called in some of the academic literature, Citizens Plus, in the case of Indigenous groups, with equal citizenship? How do you reconcile the democratic principle that requires that all of us have a say in the rules that we live by with a form of government that based on, where membership in that government, the ability to vote for those governments is based on ancestry. And what happens when those decisions start going beyond the immediate purview of a Indigenous government and go to public land, resource development, all kinds of issues. So I've kind of been thinking about this for a weirdly long time. And I realized, like, if I'm going to speak, like, it's so complex and so deep. And the scary thing is the more you know about it, the more you know you don't know, as with anything. And so people often will say, well, you must know about this. And I'm always fearful of saying I know anything because there's just so many different angles to this. But I realized, like, I'm going to have to get really deep and really try to understand at least the theoretical piece of it so that I can kind of apply that to some of these real life things that I could see coming down the pipe. Especially, well, anyway, so I started that and finished it. But yeah, what I did was I looked at Canada's version of liberal democracy. I took a set of fairly well-known democratic criteria, and then I went and looked at Indigenous constitutions and tried as just a form of a representation of how they've chosen to govern themselves. They've adopted these constitutions, ratified them, and this is how they've said they're going to govern themselves. And I've checked those constitutions against those democratic criteria and tried to understand where those tensions lie. Not to get too deep into it. I already am. I can feel it.
No, I actually want you to go deep. So one of the criticisms my mom, my wife, my dad, you're way too nerdy. You don't explain anything in these terms that you use. So yeah, no, we are not a popular news outlet here. So I want you to go as nerdy as possible. But before you even go super nerdy, I wanted to ask you a nerdy question. So you mentioned constitutions, and actually, I was talking with JJ McCullough about it. So he's a guy who's, massive YouTuber, 1 million followers. I said, JJ, how do you trick people with all your flashing and jumping around? And, it seems like you're superficial. But he did a couple episodes on the Canadian Constitution and the difference between written constitution versus unwritten constitution and what all is included in what we understand to be the Canadian Constitution. And so that led us down a rabbit trail of written versus unwritten and what's included in the unwritten aspects of a constitution. And then when you start talking about cultures that really don't prioritize a written history, and we talk about them having a constitution. And so when you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, what does that mean? How are we even able to compare? So I want you to dilate a bit on this. And it sounds like you're saying these two approaches to constitutionalism right within Canada perhaps can't coexist. Never mind the specifics about ancestry, Citizens Plus, Section 35, Section 25. I don't know what those sections say, but so it sounds like there are particularities that are at odds. But it even seems to me that perhaps the whole general approach is at odds because Canada, as I understand it, is kind of unique, having an unwritten constitution that goes back to Magna Carta, as I understand it. So tell me what I said that was wrong.
So what I did is I looked at these constitutions of self-governing Indigenous groups. There's a certain number that have actual formal self-government provisions, kind of where they've worked out those provisions with the government of Canada. So there's not actually that many. And usually a provision of self-government is that there's a constitution that will be developed and ratified by the community, which is the case. And usually those constitutions are publicly available. So that's what I looked at. I say in my dissertation, like as a qualifier right off the bat, like the groups that have actually taken the steps to form these self-government agreements, that have actually gone and done these constitutions, this may actually be like a skewed sample of the different ways of governing in these communities because it suggests like a certain proactiveness and maybe even progressiveness in terms of what they're wanting to do for their people. And so when you read the constitutions, one of the interesting things that I find in my research is for all my talk of the tensions, there's a lot of compatibilities too. You see some role for kind of elders in communities that might be akin to something like our Senate, right? You have reference to the Creator where ours makes reference to God, right? And it's like there's different things where it's like it's not as different as you think it's going to be in the one that I reviewed. And I don't want to go into all those details, but the tensions that are there are not small ones. And it's not so much what in those constitutions as a broader kind of question of the entire approach. Like, as I said, like, how do you reconcile democratic principles with ancestry-based membership in political communities? Like, that is a very tough thing to try to reconcile. How much can a whole question around should the charter actually apply to Indigenous government? Believe it or not, that is a massive debate that's been taking place for a long time. I, of course, believe that government has an obligations to its citizens, Indigenous or not. And so the government has no right to shield Indigenous community from charter scrutiny, right? And that's the whole question that there are people out there who say, well, how dare you have the charter applying to us that's colonial and it's telling us how we should govern, and we have our own ideas about how we want to do that. I, as someone who thinks these things are kind of important, says, you've got to ensure the basic rights of every individual are protected, whether their government is an Indigenous one or not. So there's so many angles to it, and it's hard to pick just one. But I would say some of the biggest challenges arise from the kind of just the very basic notion of ancestry-based governance is where you start running into the biggest tensions with liberal democratic principles.
So I like your call to an appreciative inquiry as well. It's trying to find commonalities, trying to find ways that we might overlap, because something that I didn't expect, actually, I think it was with respect to, it was industrial development or pipelines. And one First Nations guy was speaking, and he said, one of the first things we ask ourselves, at least in our community, is how will this development impact our community? How will it impact our families and our homes and our whatever we're doing with our current land? And that is a very different, it seems different anyways, to a lot of the approaches that we see in Southern Ontario, for example. The Southern Ontario would say, well, what's the environmental impact? That's it. We don't really care how it impacts families and, your farmer's market or anything. So what? If it has no environmental impact or minimal environmental impact, but you lose your farmer's market, so what? Sucks to be you guys. Whereas the Indigenous communities take the opposite approach. They said, no, this is our whatever market from forever as far as we can remember. And so we are going to fight this on that basis alone. So to your point about a heightened emphasis or importance on community, tradition, family, connection, I think there are opportunities for commonalities that we can find. But this whole, I think it's a mess that you've waded into. So kudos to you for wading into it. It makes my head spin. My sense is it's so messy and tangled. It seems like people want to advance whatever position within that mess is good for them. So we'll get more money out of it. Great. That's the position we'll take. We'll get resource development and more money. Great. That's the position we'll take. Or you're telling us now we need to change the way we live. No, we're gonna oppose that. Now, is that just me being overly cynical about it, or like how do you remain hopeful? You've really stepped into a very deep mud puddle. That's my impression.
Yeah, it's hard. It's one of the hardest issues in our country, and but I think that's all the more reason to talk about it. And as I say, the more that I know, the more I know that I don't know. And so every day I'm turning a new corner of, something that I wasn't aware of or an angle that I hadn't explored. And then there are really important Indigenous perspectives on this issue too that I follow and try to learn from and I find very interesting. So yeah, there's a lot to it. But I think one thing that you're touching on, it's like a kind of almost, I see like a practical angle to it as well, is this issue of sort of competing interests in some cases. So one of my big criticisms of the direction that the BC government has taken, I mean, I talked about democratic impacts, but another big one, there's actually a few. I mean, the big things I usually talk about are democratic impacts, obviously economic or prosperity impact. There's the social cohesion impacts, which I think are actually really important. And then the other piece is that kind of just broader public interest impact and the kind of the question of Indigenous communities, and this is kind of getting to what you were saying, Indigenous communities, they're quite rightly tasked with speaking for their respective communities. That is their job, right? That's their role, is to look out for the public interest of their unique community. It may differ very greatly from the broader public interest, the provincial public interest or the Canadian public interest. It may differ from another Indigenous group's interest. And you see this, right? You see disputes between groups about different projects. And just to name one, there's the Citizens Project on BC's North Coast, which is an LNG project led by the Nisga'a Nation in development with some other private sector partners. And the federal government's approval of that project has been taken to court by two other nations in the project area, who both say this is going to impact our traditional territory and our title claims. So, a lot of the time, I think it's very easy to make a mistake of saying, like, Indigenous issues are this and British Columbian interests are that, when in fact they vary very greatly between themselves, and also sometimes even within themselves. And a good example of that, since I'm just giving actual examples, is the Coastal GasLink project, which was a pipeline to supply some of these LNG facilities, again, in BC's north. In that case, the proponent had gone and struck deals with every elected council along the band council along the pipeline route. And what happened was some hereditary chiefs stepped forward and said, well, actually, these guys don't speak for our community. We do. And we don't like that. For whatever reason. And that led to the whole, I don't mean whatever reason in a dismissive way. I just don't want to get into all the details of why. And that led to all kinds of protests. The wetland territory may ring a bell to you. Like that, this was all about that, where this all led. So there's not just disputes between nations, but disputes within nations, disputes between the British Columbian public interest and all these unique interests. So this is why, I do tend to I get very worried about this issue. Because British Columbia, you have 200 different Indigenous groups. Canada had over 200. Canada has about 600. BC has a third of them. Obviously, we're one of 10 provinces. So the issues are, and of course, we're not a treated territory. There's treaties covering a lot of the rest of Canada, most of the rest of Canada, that set out obligations to Indigenous groups between the federal government and so on, whereas British Columbia largely does not have that. So yes, a mud puddle. It's very messy. And I think that's why it's so important to speak up on the different aspects of it.
Yeah. And I liked how you mentioned interests, because it seems like people are using the Indigenous issues, tensions that arise, to advance particular political interests. And I can't help wondering whether they really care about the people who they're using to leverage the agenda that they're trying to advance. So I don't want to talk about my own family, but I have very, very close relations with First Nations. I'll just leave it at that. And I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that the progressive face that is put on many of these issues, I would say all, but we'll qualify it and say many of these issues, is not representative of the broader First Nations community. Very often they would say, yeah, you guys are crazy. That's white man talk. Yeah, we would never talk like that. That doesn't make any sense. And yeah, renaming streets and all that kind of stuff, whatever. We're not really actually very interested in that business. But it seems to me that some people, generally non-Indigenous people, are very interested in leveraging this as a point of conflict that they can use to advance their political causes. Now, maybe that's putting you in too awkward of a situation. You don't even have to answer it, but that's my perception from outside. I'm just wondering if you've had a similar perceptions in the BC experience.
Yeah, I would point to some leaders who I think have been really incredible for their communities, like Ellis Ross, federal MP, who represents an area in British Columbia, who has done great things for his people by embracing economic development and and making sure that it works and lifts people up. And so rather than speaking for anybody, I would just point to him and say, what a great example. There's others too. Karen Restel is someone who I admire very much. I follow her work. And I think she has some really interesting perspectives on these issues and just how, and again, I'm not going to try to put words in her mouth, but I will try to kind of state my understanding of or my takeaways from some of what she said, which is that there's a lot of actors out there who want to say that they speak for First Nation, oppose everything, where you actually look around and you see these leaders like Alice or Karen or others who are quite clear when they talk about these issues that there's some real opportunities that can be missed from that kind of approach to it.
Right. So I want to pivot a bit. You mentioned your kids in school, you mentioned their education, and you also have a fairly hard stop within 5 or 10 minutes at the top of the hour. We had some tech issues, so this might be a little bit shorter than usual. But I wanted to ask you, it's tied into what we've just discussed, but also into without diminishment. It seems like the world has changed. So I often point to 2008 financial crisis, 2015 Trump coming down the elevator, 2016 Brexit and the election of Trump, 2020 COVID, 2022 Ukraine, 2023 Israel. So all of these massive events makes me have the sense, or I get the sense that we are living, I would argue, I'll put it that way, I would argue that we are living in a fundamentally different world than 2007, before the financial crisis. I think in 2008, you could say, well, it's a crisis and we'll get through it and we'll recover back to normal, whatever normal is. It feels like normal has changed. That's a good way to say it. It feels like normal has changed. So I wonder if you have that same sense. And with respect to your kids and their education and the generation around us that can't afford to buy houses, do you have a sense that things have changed? And if so, where is your mind going with respect to how to regain a new sense of normal? Where are the positive lights where are the opportunities? Where do the opportunities lie given the new normal we're in? There, I finally got to a question. It took me about 3 minutes, but where do the opportunities lie given the new normal that we are struggling to identify?
Well, look, I agree with you that the world seems to have shifted in some really important ways, where a lot of the old solutions, it's almost going full circle to the beginning of our conversation, but a lot of the old solutions kind of aren't quite hitting the nail on the head, or whatever the expression is. Like, they're not actually like getting to where we need to be in the conversations we need to be having. And yeah, I think all the things that you listed in terms of those changes that you've watched, I've watched too. And I think we have a very similar stance on that. And so it is kind of a question of, like, if we are fighting if we're using the same rhetoric, like in British Columbia, like everyone talks about the Free Enterprise Coalition on the right? Oh, we just need to revive the Free Enterprise Coalition. And it's like, okay, first of all, most people have no idea what that means. But it's a very economically oriented answer to questions that go way beyond mere economic. And I think that where without diminishment emerged from in terms of our own minds is just saying, like, what other things do we need to be talking about? And how are we actually equipping ourselves to solve some of these problems? If we're afraid on the right to talk about something like immigration, for example, that has had such huge impact and made life almost impossible for the younger generation to buy homes, to get and everyone to get the services that they need, including newcomers. If we can't even have that conversation, and then the other piece of that, I mean, I'm mentioning more economic, I think, sided implications of immigration, like housing prices, let's say rent prices and healthcare services or whatever. But there's also like that kind of social cohesion, national identity piece in it too. where are we making sure that we're maintaining a population that's interested in the kind of values that makes us Canadian. I do believe that anyone can become Canadian by becoming part of our kind of shared fabric, our shared values, our shared history, and kind of partnering to make Canada better. I think that's like a very true thing about Canada. But if you have an environment where you have folks coming to this country who have no interest in that at all, how do we actually stay cohesive as a society? Like these are so. Yeah. I feel like I'm kind of like getting off the main course of your question, but I think what I'm trying to say is there's new issues, and the old approaches to talking about them isn't going to work anymore. And to education too. Like, I was having this conversation, I think yesterday, and we were talking about, and this is just one example, it happens to be something I talk about a lot, but land acknowledgements in schools. My kids go to school every day, and kids go down to the office, and they into the loudspeaker or whatever, they two kids like together say this land acknowledgement, and all the kids listen, and every single day, just like they sing the Coast Salish anthem alongside O Canada at every school assembly. I look at those things and I think, okay, well, like take the anthem, and I hope I'm not rambling, but take the anthem, for example. Like the Canadian anthem is about bringing, or any national anthem is about building a healthy affinity for the political community to which you're one day going to belong and participate in actively as a citizen, right? And when you're singing an anthem alongside your national anthem for a community that you can never belong to and never participate in by virtue of your ancestry.
What anthem are they singing?
They call it the Coast Salish anthem in this particular area, so that the Coast Salish is the broader kind of characterization of some of the Indigenous groups that exist in the region. So having kids sing that when they have no ability to belong to that political community, I think is it's good to learn it for cultural reasons. Sure, like learn about different cultures. That's actually a very positive thing. But to sing it alongside O Canada in that way, to me, is actually a very troubling message. Just like the land acknowledgements. Like if you think about America with their oath of allegiance, I don't even know if they still do it. Probably they do. I don't know. But that is something where you're all saying, we together belong to this thing. You compare that to a land acknowledgement that every day, and you're saying just right off the top of every single day for these kids, some kids have a greater claim to this land than you do. The land that you live and learn and play on, children, it only kind of belongs to you. It actually belongs to these people more. And so I just look at that and I think, God, it's so divisive and it's so bad for the way these children are even brought up to think about the world. I've got totally off track in my answer. I got way off track. And I don't think I answered your actual question again, but please tell me or feel free to ask again.
No, this is awesome. Yeah, because that was one of the themes I've asked a lot of people. What is the stickiness that holds Canadians together, right? I often ask people, well, what is Canada? What is our stickiness? What's the basis of our stickiness? To your point about race, I like to highlight this whenever I can. Roger Scruton wrote in his book, England and Elegy. He said, we are a country of strangers held together by shared manners. And so anyone could become an English person. And certainly with all the colonies, I'm not defending the British Empire or the colonies or anything like that, but many people, you say, yeah, no, they're clearly English and they're not white. They're any shade of, the melanin content in their skin has nothing to do with it. But they've adopted the manners and the history and the presuppositions about what it means to love that weird island, in the North Sea. And we seem to be doing exactly the opposite. We are driving a stake in every opportunity in our points of difference, not in our shared manners. And in fairness, though, too, also, this is something I've been taking every opportunity to say, if you and I, or you and all the people on your Without Diminishment editorial board, were shipped off somewhere where no one speaks English, there's no Canadian culture around, and you and I found each other at the market, the three or four, I don't know how many you got now, 10. The 10 of you, we all found each other. We would say, oh my goodness, it's so nice to meet a fellow Canadian. Listen, where do I get vegetables? Where's the best place to get gas? Oh, you live in that apartment? Great. I'm gonna get an apartment there too. And so we can't blame people for not integrating when they come in. It's so massive amounts when we talk about the rate of immigration. How could they possibly learn what it means to be a Canadian? You and I wouldn't learn what it meant to be, pick any country that we were dumped into, away from any attachment. So I do feel bad. I feel we've ruined the immigration system, and we've created an impossible barrier for these new Canadians. My heart breaks for them, and I don't know how to fix it. Like how can we now introduce what it means to be a Canadian? They go to public schools and they're singing multiple national anthems. I mean, what hope is there for the? Anyways, okay, I'm being very hopeless. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna. Excuse me. I was gonna say on that question. These young children, and there's many in my children's school who've come from other countries. They're going to school and they are listening, exactly as you say, to two anthems being sung. They're listening to land acknowledgements, again, as I spoke about earlier, suggesting that different people have different claims to the land based on their ancestry. They're hearing a version of Canada that focuses almost entirely on the wrong stand in the past, rather than the kind of wonderful, amazing things that make up the project of Canada. Building the railroad, the kind of, I don't know, pioneer spirit, the incredible contributions of Indigenous people in those times, and the partnerships that formed to actually make this country happen in the first place. Like, there's some really interesting and cool and inspiring stories to tell, and we're not telling them. So, and in fact, we're saying, is Canada legitimate? We just had Premier David Eby in British Columbia say some of his reconciliation policies are about, and this is a quote, fixing the original colonial mistake. British Columbia is a mistake to this government, right? And that's the way that it's being portrayed every day. So if you're a newcomer to this country, you're probably like, where even am I? Like, what is this place? And do I even want to really integrate? Because it doesn't sound like they have such a great history or such a great people. We have our House of Commons saying that this is an actively genocidal state. Like, my goodness. And I don't believe any of that. I think I think Canada is a very welcoming, good country, and there's many reasons why many people want to come here and join us here. And I think that's a good thing, and something that we should be proud of.
Yeah, brilliant.
Hey, that was positive.
That was very positive.
We were positive on this.
That was very positive. And building on the history thing, I would say so I'm really getting into sort of an intellectual conservatism. At least those are the books titles that I'm reading, or philosophical conservatism. And one of the planks in that whole body of knowledge is the idea of where our knowledge comes from. And one of the comments is an historical epistemology. So a theory of knowledge that comes from history. Not that you're worshiping history, but that you're looking at history as this long series of trial and error. And guess what? There are going to be lots more errors than successes. But you need those errors and successes to be able to sift through and pull out these beautiful things. You mentioned the railway. You could mention farming across the prairies. Pick whatever you want. Resource development, fisheries, developing our coastal, our coastlines, national parks. Pick whatever you want and say, look, because of what we were able to do together, we developed these beautiful things. And isn't this wonderful? Anyways, I'm rambling. I'm going to have to edit all this out. I need to ask you, what do you wish I would have asked you? Or what are you saying, you know what, gosh, Watley, you're totally missing the boat here. You need to be thinking about this. What keeps you awake at night? Or tell us what you think we need to do next. So I've given you about 3 or 4 different options to take this. What should we be thinking about right now?
I think we need to be thinking about creating, and this is kind of going back to maybe again, all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. What does the right need to do to motivate and energize and inspire the public, to offer a version of our movement, but also our country, our people, that makes people excited and makes them excited to join us, makes us a compelling option. Because I do think, the future of this country hangs on the ability to elect leaders in government that are willing to stand up for, I think, the version of Canada that we all yearn for. And I think that opportunity is there with the right message. And I think we just have to figure out how to, we just had probably an almost hour-long conversation about all of these things. Obviously, we went far too deep for most people's interest level, but kind of pulling out the main pieces of that and saying, like, how do we actually inspire people to think more about some of these things and to have their own say in it and their own contributions as well.
Compelling, excited, inspirational. What a great place to end. Dr. Elliott, thanks so much for making the time for us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.